Hiring managers are not reading your portfolios to learn about your project. They are reading your portfolio to learn about you. One thing that doesn't get talked about enough about UX research portfolios is that most of them show what you did. Very few of them actually show how you think, which is not necessarily wrong, but hiring managers, they are almost always trying to figure out the second one, how you think. So in this video, we are going to talk about what hiring managers are actually evaluating when they open your portfolio, and how to build a portfolio that makes your thinking visible, not just your process. Because there is a mindset that changed how I look at portfolios. Hiring managers are not reading your portfolios to learn about your project. They are reading your portfolio to learn about you. The project is simply the vehicle. Because here's the truth. You could spend months building your UX research portfolio, carefully documenting every project, every method, every deliverable, and still open it one day and think to yourself, wait, does this really tell the right story about me? And once you start to look at portfolios through that lens, a lot of things start to make sense. Like why some portfolios feel incredibly convincing even when the project is not necessarily flashy. Like why some portfolios look flashy, but they still leave you unconvinced. Or maybe even why two people will work on almost identical projects and leave completely different impressions. We are going to get into all of this in this video. We'll talk about what hiring managers are actually evaluating when they look at your portfolio. We'll talk about what separates portfolios that feel weak from those that feel credible. We'll talk about how to structure your portfolio in a way that makes your thinking visible, and what all of this means if you're transitioning into UX research from another field. And by the end of this video, my hope is that you stop asking, what should I add to my portfolio? And you start asking, what is my portfolio communicating about how I think? Because that one question can completely change how you approach your portfolio. And before we get into this video, if you're seeing my face for the first time, hi, my name is Toby Lasese. I'm a user experience researcher. I currently work in the quantum computing application domain. And on this channel, I talk everything UX research from starting out to career advancement. So if that's something that might interest you, please make sure to subscribe. I'd love for you to stick around. Now let's get into the video. Before we get into what makes a strong portfolio, I'd love to acknowledge something first. Portfolio advice can be confusing, and I don't think that's any of your fault. If you're trying to break into UX research, you're probably hearing different opinions. One person might say you need 3 case studies. Another might say, oh, 2 is enough. One person might say every project needs measurable impact. Another person might say, oh, impacts matter less than people really think. And after a while, it starts to feel like everyone got a different memo. And then you open LinkedIn, or maybe you even open somebody else's portfolio, and suddenly everyone looks experienced. Every project looks polished. Every case study looks intentional. And if you've ever looked at somebody else's portfolio and maybe immediately start to question your own, you're definitely not alone, because that's where the spiral starts. You start to think, maybe I don't have enough projects. Maybe my experience is not relevant. Maybe I need one more case study to be ready. And before they realize, people spend months trying to close a gap that may not even exist. And here's what I think is happening. A lot of people become so focused on looking like a UX researcher that they stop thinking about how to communicate that they think like a researcher. And trust me, those two are not the same thing. And I'll explain. Looking like a UX researcher is often about appearances, like trying to copy what a successful portfolio looks like trying to impress, like trying to match the visual templates, which is okay. All of this is okay. On the other hand, thinking like a UX researcher is about credibility. It's about making your thinking visible, helping other people understand how you approach problems. And a lot of portfolio advice focuses entirely on the first one, on how to look like a UX researcher. Like, what should your homepage look like? How many projects should you have? Should you include journey maps? Should you include personas? Should you include metrics? And all of that is okay. All of that are not bad questions, but they are not the important ones, because two people can have portfolios with similar structures but leave two completely different impressions. And you might ask why. That's because structure is not the whole story. The thinking behind the structure matters too. So if the goal is not just to look like a researcher, if the real goal is to communicate that you think like a researcher, then the question becomes, what are hiring managers actually looking for when they open your portfolio? I think a lot of people imagine hiring managers opening their portfolio and carefully evaluating every deliverable, every method, every artifact, every section. And yes, those things matter. They really matter. But something more fundamental is happening underneath all of that. People are trying to decide whether they can trust you with a real research problem. Let's think through some of the questions that might run through someone's head when they review your portfolio. A good example might be, would I trust this person to investigate something when the answer is not obvious? Another good one might be, would I trust this person to make thoughtful decisions under pressure? Would I trust them to communicate insights and findings clearly? Would I trust them when things don't go according to plan? Let's be clear, nobody puts those questions on a portfolio checklist. But those are often what people are trying to figure out when they review your portfolio. And here's how they figure it out. The same way we figure out things about people, through evidence. And in this case, your explanations are evidence, your decisions are evidence, your reasoning is evidence, the way you frame a problem is evidence. Even the trade-off you discuss are evidence. And all of it is helping someone to build a picture of how you think. So here's the question I want you to keep in your mind for the rest of this video. And actually, whenever you review your portfolio. And the question is, what is this communicating? Not what am I showing, not what activity am I describing, but what is this communicating about how I think? And I'll show you what I mean with an example. Imagine I open your portfolio and I read, we conducted 12 interviews and identified key themes. That's great, but what is that communicating? Honestly, not very much. Yes, I know what happened. You conducted 12 interviews. But I don't know why it happened. I don't know what the team was trying to understand. I don't know why interviews made sense for that problem. I don't know what decision led to that approach. Fine, I know the activity, but I don't know the thinking behind it. Now compare that with something like this. At the time, the team had several competing assumptions about why users were abandoning the workflow. Because we still didn't understand what was driving these decisions, I chose semi-structured interviews to better understand users' motivations, barriers, and decision-making process. You see how much that communicates. Now I'm learning that this person understood the problem they were trying to solve, that they chose a method intentionally, that there was reasoning behind that approach, that they were trying to answer a specific question, and that helps me to understand how they think. You see that the second example is not necessarily a better project. It's just a better explanation. And that's really important distinction, because a lot of people think they need more impressive project, when what they actually need is a better way of communicating the thinking that already exists inside their work. Because strong portfolios don't just tell you what happened. They help you understand why those things happened, why decisions were made, why certain methods were chosen, why particular insights mattered. Ultimately, they make the thinking visible. And that's where credibility comes from. Not from the most polished visual or the most impressive company name, but from helping someone understand how you think. Now that we've established what hiring managers are really looking for, let's talk about something that I find quite interesting. Why do some portfolios still feel weak even when they look polished? Because you've probably seen them. Beautiful websites, clean design, well-structured case study, everything looking intentional. And yet something still feels missing. You finish reading and you can't quite place your finger on it, but you are not completely convinced. I think the gap between those portfolios and the ones that really work comes down to one thing: the difference between performing UX research and demonstrating research thinking. And here's why this happens so often. It's because for most of us, we learn UX research through frameworks, through method, through processes. So naturally, when it comes to building a portfolio, we naturally document those things. We say things like we conducted interviews, we created affinity maps, we identified themes, we presented recommendations. And here's the challenge: a portfolio can tell me everything you did without necessarily helping me understand how you were thinking. And that's where things start to break down. Let's use our question. Imagine I read, we conducted 15 interviews, identified recurring themes, and created recommendations for the product team. Now remember the question I said you should keep in mind. What does that actually communicate? Yes, I know what happened, but I don't know why any of it happened. First, why interviews? What was the team struggling with? What uncertainty were existing? Did anything surprise you? What challenged your assumption? And how did you arrive at the recommendations that you gave? You see, I know the activities, but I don't know the thinking behind them. And that's exactly what I meant by performing UX research. This portfolio example that I gave now is showing me the process, but it's hiding the thinking. It's showing me the output, but it's not showing me the judgment that was made. Now, let's compare that with this. The team believed users were abandoning the workflow because it took too long to complete. Before proposing solutions, I wanted to understand whether time was actually the issue or whether something deeper was happening. That's why I chose interviews as an initial method. Now, you agree with me that that communicated so much more. I learned that there was uncertainty. We can see that the assumptions existed, and that this person was actively trying to investigate those assumptions that they had. We can see that there was real reasoning behind the choice of the method. And again, that is not a better project. That is just a better explanation. Another pattern that I tend to see a lot is what I call process dumping. That's when a portfolio spends like 3 pages explaining every workshop, every artifact, every deliverable, and by the end you are exhausted. I've seen portfolios where I know every single thing a person did, but I don't know what they learned or why any of it mattered. And that's not because the work wasn't valuable. It's because the portfolio got so focused on documenting the process that it forgot to tell the story. And the story is actually what people are trying to uncover. And so once you understand that, the question shifts. You stop asking, oh, how can I add more things to my portfolio? And you start asking, how can I make my thinking more visible? And that's a completely different question. And if you ask me, that's usually a much more useful one. So if weak portfolios hide thinking, what exactly do strong portfolios communicate? That's one of my favorite parts of this conversation, because once you start to notice it, it's very difficult to unsee. One thing I would say that I've noticed about strong portfolios is that they really make me think, oh wow, this project is so impressive. Rather, I think, wow, this person seems so thoughtful. And that's a different reaction. And here's something that might surprise you. Strong portfolios don't communicate perfection. They don't tell me that the project went flawlessly without any issue, or that the researcher always had the right answer. And to be honest, That's okay. That's a good thing because real research doesn't work that way. We know that research can be messy. Research involves uncertainty. Research involves changing direction. It involves learning new things that you didn't expect. And strong portfolios, they aren't afraid to show all that. So you might ask me, what do strong portfolios communicate instead? A few things come up over and over, and for the sake of this video, I've pulled them together and I'll go ahead and tell you about them now. For each one, I will show you an example because they are much easier to show than to describe. First on my list is intentionality. Intentionality here means I can see this person made deliberate choices, not just default ones, not this is what we always do kind of choices, but deliberate ones. And here's an example of what that difference could look like. Without intentionality, someone could say, we chose interviews to gather qualitative data. But with intentionality, even for the same project, we can say, we chose interviews because we needed to understand motivation, not just behavior. A survey would have told us what users did, but not why they were doing it. One is a default, the other is a decision, and you can feel the difference immediately. Intentionality actually builds trust because it tells me you were actually thinking, not just executing. Second on my list is reasoning. Reasoning means I don't just see what happened, I actually understand why it happened. Very similar to what I've been saying since. And this doesn't just show up in your method choice, it also shows up in how you talk about your findings. Let me show you a good example. Without reasoning, someone might say, users found the checkout process confusing. And now with reasoning, another person might say, users found the checkout process confusing, but not because the interface was unclear. They were confused because they didn't know how many steps were left, which made it hard to decide whether to continue or abandon. That distinction changed everything about our recommendations. Do you see the difference? The first one tells us what happened. Okay. The second one tells us what happened and how you were thinking about what happened. And that's where credibility comes in. Not from the answer, but from the reasoning behind it. Next is judgment. This one almost never appears on any portfolio checklist, but it might as well be the most important quality of all. Because research is constantly putting you in situations where there are no obvious answers. You have incomplete information, you have limited resources, you have limited time, even conflicting stakeholder opinions. And judgment is how you navigate all of that. Let me show you an example of what that could look like in practice. We only had 2 weeks before the design deadline. So instead of running a full diary study, I chose a shorter intercept method that could still answer our core question about decision making without delaying the team. You see that one sentence, it tells me so much. That you understood the constraint and you made a deliberate call. That you didn't just default to whatever method that you knew best. That right there is judgment. And good judgment is so valuable because that's exactly what someone needs from a researcher on a real team under real pressure. Another one is curiosity, and curiosity in a portfolio isn't necessarily about personality. It's about how you approach problems. It shows up in different ways. It shows up whether you were trying to understand something or maybe even just documenting what you observed. And let me show you an example of what that could look like in practice. Without curiosity, someone might say, users skip the tutorial. Now, someone with curiosity might say the same thing this way. Users skipped the tutorial, which made us wonder, was it because they didn't see value in it or because they were confident that they didn't need it? That distinction mattered a lot for what we ended up recommending, so we dug into it. The second version tells me that this person wasn't just collecting data. They were actively trying to understand what that data meant. And that kind of curiosity is exactly what makes research valuable to a team. Another one is learning. One of the things I love most in a portfolio is evidence that someone learned something new. And I don't necessarily mean they learned a new method. I mean something surprised them, something changed. And here's what that might look like in an example. We initially assumed the drop-off was a usability issue. What we actually found was that users understood the interface fine. They just didn't trust the product enough to enter their personal information. That completely shifted our recommendations away from design changes and towards trust building. Now, that is not weakness, that is the work. And a moment like that in a portfolio doesn't make you look like you got it wrong. It actually makes you look like someone who was paying close enough attention to notice when their assumptions needed updating. And if you think about it, that's self-awareness, that's growth. And those are qualities that I would much rather see than a perfectly polished story where nothing went wrong. And when you put all of this together, intentionality, reasoning, judgment, curiosity, learning, something starts to emerge. And that is trust. When I read a portfolio, think about it. I'm not just learning about the project. I'm gradually building an impression about the person. I'm gradually building confidence in the person. I'm starting to see that they can navigate uncertainty, that they can make thoughtful decisions, that they can investigate meaningful questions, that they can learn and adapt when things don't necessarily go as planned. And all of that on its own is powerful. Because remember that a portfolio is not evidence that you can follow a UX template. It's evidence that you think through problem. It's evidence that you approach problem thoughtfully. And a strong portfolio should make that thinking visible. And here's the thing, if you're actually thinking in your head, so where do I put all of this? Next, I'm going to show you exactly where each of these qualities show up in a typical case study structure. So at this point, you're probably thinking, okay, Toby, I get it. Strong portfolio, communicate thinking. But what exactly does that look like when I sit down to write a case study? And that's exactly the right question, because trust me, a lot of us learn concepts and then translating it becomes where we get stuck. So let me share a structure that I really find helpful. But before I do, disclaimer, one important thing to note is that this is not a magic template. This is not a use this template and get hired kind of thing. That's not how portfolios work. Think of it more as a way to organize your story so that your thinking becomes very visible and easier to see. That's actually the goal. So first, start with the problem, not the project. And when I say that, what I mean is a lot of portfolios jump straight into describing the company, the product, the context. And that's not necessarily wrong, but I think there's a more useful place to start. I would say start with the problem, start with the uncertainty, start with those things that weren't yet understood. There's a reason why research exists. Research happens because somebody doesn't know something. Somebody has a question. Somebody is trying to make a decision, but they don't have enough information yet. That's where your story begins. So instead of saying something like, this project focused on improving the onboarding experience for a financial application, you can try something like this. The team noticed that many users were abandoning onboarding, but we didn't yet understand why. Before making any design changes, we needed to understand what was actually driving that behavior. See how much more that communicates right away. I understood the problem immediately. I understood the uncertainty. I understood why the research mattered. And if you ask me, that's a much stronger starting point because it puts your decision making in context right from the very first sentence. 2, make your research thinking visible. If I had to pick one section that separates average portfolios from really strong ones, it would have to be this one, because this is the section where most people accidentally default to activity reporting mode. It's very easy to unconsciously default to reporting activity, saying things like we conducted interviews, we ran usability testing, we analyze the results. First, none of that is wrong, but it doesn't tell me much about how you were thinking during those processes. Instead of doing that, try explaining why did you choose the method, what were you trying to learn, what assumptions were you testing, if any, what constraints existed, what alternatives did you consider, what trade-offs did you make. Let me show you an example to see what that difference could look like. One version could say, we conducted 10 user interviews. Okay, that doesn't communicate much beyond the activity itself. You conducted 10 interviews. Okay. A stronger version of that could be something like, at the time, the team had several competing explanations for why users were dropping off. Because we needed to understand motivations and decision-making rather than measure behavior at scale, I chose semi-structured interviews. Now I'm saying reasoning, I'm saying intentionality, I'm saying judgment. Remember those qualities we mentioned earlier? You see, that one shift from describing what you did to explaining why you did it actually changes the entire feel of a case study. And third, I would say focus on insights, not just findings. This is another place where portfolios often become weaker than they need to be, because many people present findings and fewer people actually explain insights, and those are not the same thing. A finding, for instance, might be something like, 8 out of 10 participants said they found onboarding confusing. On the other hand, an insight might be something like this. Users weren't struggling because the interface was difficult. They were struggling because they lacked confidence to make decisions with incomplete information. Do you see the difference? One tells me what happened. That's the finding. The other helps me to understand why it happened. That's the insight. And research is almost always more valuable when it helps people to understand the why, because that's actually what informs decisions. Fourth section, I would say, show the decisions your research enabled. A lot of portfolios jump from insight straight into recommendations, and sometimes that's okay, that's fine. But I think there's a more interesting and more powerful story to tell. And that is what decisions were possible because of your research, what decisions were enabled because of your research, what uncertainty was reduced, what changed. In other words, what's the impact of your research? So instead of just saying we recommended simplifying onboarding, you might say something like this. The research helped the team understand that users needed more confidence and guidance during onboarding, not fewer screens. As a result, the team shifted focus towards helping users understand the implications of their choices rather than just reducing friction. Now I'm learning how the research actually influenced decision making. I'm learning the impact of the research. That's the whole point of research. And showing that connection makes your work feel more meaningful. And one last section I would add is include reflection. And honestly, this might be the most overlooked sections in portfolios, reflection. That part where we talk about what surprised you, what would you do differently today? What assumptions turned out to be wrong? What did you learn? How did your thinking evolve? I personally love seeing this in portfolios because it tells me so much. It tells me someone is paying attention, that they are growing, that they are honest about their process. Because really, most research don't go perfectly. And the researchers who acknowledge that, who use that as part of their story, often appear to be more credible. Now, if you take a step back and look at all the 5 parts that I mentioned, all the 5 sections that I mentioned, something interesting starts to happen. You're no longer just documenting a project. You are actually telling the story of how a researcher approached the problem. You are showing the uncertainty, you are showing the learning, you are showing the decisions, you are showing the insights. And all of that makes your reasoning visible. All of that makes your thinking visible. And as we've established today, that's really what people are trying to see. That's what people are trying to understand about you. Now, I want to be clear, not every project needs all of these 5 elements, all of these 5 parts in equal measure. Some projects lend themselves more naturally to certain parts than others. The goal is not to force every case study into the same mold. The goal is to ask yourself, am I making my thinking visible? That's the question that matters. All of this is just to help guide you. Now, I want to talk to people who are maybe transitioning to UX research and watching this video. I am maybe thinking, okay, Toby, this all sounds great, but I don't have traditional UX research experience. So what do I put in my portfolio? I hear you. I actually hear you. And that's one of the most common concerns that I hear from aspiring UX researchers. The concern usually sounds something like, oh, okay, I understand the theory, I understand the process, but I don't have enough UX research experience. And while that is sometimes true, one thing I've noticed is that many people underestimate how much relevant experience they already have. Now, it's not because they are lacking experience, but it's because they are evaluating their experience through the wrong lens. A lot of people look at their experience, they look at their backgrounds and ask themselves, was this UX research? If the answer is no, they dismiss it entirely. But I think a more useful question to ask is, what research thinking skill was I already using? Because those are very different questions. Was this UX research, and what UX research thinking skill was I already using? Those are 2 different questions. Let me give you some examples. Let's take teaching as an example. A teacher is constantly observing behavior, trying to understand why some of their students are struggling. In that case, they are identifying patterns, they are testing different approaches, and they are adjusting based on what they learn. They are probably communicating insights to different audiences. Is that same as UX research? Of course not. But are there elements of research thinking there? Absolutely. Someone working in customer support is another good example. They spend days airing complaints, airing frustrations, airing patterns, airing workarounds. They often develop a deep understanding of user needs and behaviors even before anyone on the product team does. Now, is that same as UX research? Maybe not, but are there elements of research thinking skills there? Absolutely. Now, let's think business analysis. You are understanding stakeholder needs, you are investigating problems, you are gathering information, you are supporting decision making. Those can be incredibly relevant experience. And that is why I'm bringing all of this up. When many people build portfolios, they become quite focused on proving that they've already been a UX researcher. But that's not always the most useful thing to focus on. Sometimes the more important task to focus on is demonstrating that you already know how to think through problems, that you know how to investigate, you know how to learn, you know how to make sense of information, you know how to communicate insights. Remember what we've been talking about throughout this video. Hiring managers are trying to figure out, would I trust this person with a real research problem? They are trying to understand how you think. And that's one of the reasons I think many people transitioning sell themselves short. They are focused on what they haven't done yet, instead of recognizing the value in what they already have done. Now, I must be clear, I'm not saying that transferable skills are the same as UX research experience. No, they are not. You still need to learn research methods, you still need to practice, you still need projects, you still need to develop your craft. All of that matters. But there's a difference between saying, I have no relevant experience and I haven't learned how to translate my experience yet. And I think a lot of people fall into that second category more than they realize. Because when I look at successful transitioners, one thing stands out. Many of them were not starting from zero. Many of them weren't starting from scratch. They were coming from valuable experiences that they've learned how to frame, they've learned how to communicate, they've learned how to connect them to UX research. And that's a very different story. So for transitioners, my advice to you would be, if you are building your UX research portfolio right now, don't just ask yourself, what UX research activity have I completed? Also ask questions like this. What experiences have taught me how to understand people? What experiences have taught me how to investigate problems? What experiences have taught me how to communicate insight? What experiences have taught me how to navigate ambiguity? Because those experiences matter, and most of the time they often become part of the story you are telling about yourself. One thing I would like you to remember is that at the end of the day, your portfolio is not just communicating what you've done, it's communicating who you are becoming. And that's especially important when you're early in your journey, because strong portfolios don't just simply document experience, they communicate potential, they communicate growth, they communicate your thinking, and that is something that a lot of people overlook. Now I want to come back to where we started from, because the reason so many portfolios don't tell the right story isn't usually because the person is not good enough. It's because most of the time the portfolio is showing what they did rather than showing how they think. And hiring managers are usually trying to figure out how you think. We've already established that. One thing I would love for you to remember is that UX research portfolios don't just showcase your project, they showcase you, they showcase your thinking. And like I said earlier, the question that I would love for you to walk away with from this video is not asking yourself, oh, what should I add to my portfolio? It is asking yourself, what is my portfolio communicating? What is my portfolio communicating about me? What is my portfolio communicating about how I think? What is my portfolio communicating about how I approach problems? What is my portfolio communicating about how I make decisions? How I handle uncertainty? How I learn? Because ultimately, that is what people are trying to understand about you. And if you're early in your journey, if you're transitioning from another field into UX research, I'd love for you to remember this. The goal is not to create a portfolio that looks perfect. Like I said earlier, the goal is to create a portfolio that helps people understand how you think. That's a very different goal. And once you start approaching your portfolio that way, a lot of things become clearer. Because at the end of the day, a portfolio is not proof that you can follow a UX research template. It's evidence that you think through problems. Now, if you're sitting there and thinking to yourself, okay, now I understand the principles, but I'd love to see what all of this looks like in a real portfolio. I'd love to see a walkthrough of a case study and what all of this look like in a real portfolio. I've got you. In my next video, we're doing exactly that. We are going to take a fictional UX research project and build the case study together all the way to writing the final portfolio write-up. So if that's something that interests you, if that's something that you think you will find helpful, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss that. Because I think it's something you really enjoy. I'm actually looking forward to that. If you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate if you give it a like. It helps more people to find the channel, and it also let me know that you would like to see more content like this. Now, if you are not subscribed yet, tell me, what are you waiting for? Why haven't you subscribed? Please subscribe. I'd love for you to join us here. Thank you. And to my returning subscribers, I've got so much love for you guys. Thank you so much for sticking around. Thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate you guys. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Are you new on this channel? Have you always been here? What's one thing you learned from this video? What's one thing you're excited about your portfolio? What's one thing you're really excited to rework on your portfolio? What's one thing you realize after watching this video? If you're transitioning, how has that journey been for you? Where are you transitioning from? How's your portfolio journey going? What's that looking like for you? Drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. I'll see you on my next one. Bye.